So it turns out my dad is not a hippie, or was a hippie. My name is Paul Klein. The decade I chose to do was the 1970s. I interviewed Doug Klein, who is my father. Doug grew up in the 70s as a student. His birth date was September 5th, 1955. I'm sorry, September 4th, 1955. He is a male Caucasian. He grew up in New Jersey as a student in high school. Some of the things he had during that time were he had a black and white television. He had a typewriter which he used for school. The typewriter had to have whiteout in case you made some mistakes. You would have to white it out. He also had a record player which he listened to music on. According to Doug, the 70s was a transitional period that bridged the gap between the technological revolution of the 1980s and the social revolution of the 1960s. I focused on some of the key social, political, and historical events that were present then. The Beatles were huge then. My dad was a big fan of the Beatles. The British invasion of Beatles music led to a worldwide influence of popular music. Disco was also very popular in the 70s. My dad was not a fan of disco. He had some friends that were into it, but he was a little bit too young, and he just was not into the whole disco scene at all. He was also not into the whole hippie drug culture. He was a few years young for the Woodstock concert, and he just wasn't into the whole culture of the drug hippie scene. The Vietnam War was big back then. My dad remembers following it with the newspaper and on TV. It was a big war back then, and he was too young for the draft, so that really didn't have an impact on him then. A few years younger than what was required for the draft. He remembers the withdrawal of the troops. He would read about it in the newspaper and see it on the TV. It was a huge media event. Some of the other events that were big then were the oil crisis of 1973 and 1978. It caused the gas prices to rise drastically, and this had a big impact on my dad's family, Doug's family, as they had trouble paying for gas because the prices went up so high. He was big into the New York Yankees. He was a big Yankees fan then and followed them, being a young student in New Jersey. The American hostage crisis was also a big historical event then. It happened, Americans were taken hostage in the Iranian embassy, and that lasted for several weeks. And Doug's family and Doug, followed the story throughout, and they were eventually let go, but that was a big historical event. Also, the resignation of Richard Nixon. That lasted about 2 years, and it was a major part of the news for those 2 years. Some of the biggest differences of growing up now versus then is obviously technology. We have computers now and the internet, which they never had in the 70s, which has created a culture that is able to get news faster, communicate with one another faster, and just stay in touch with people all around the world. Like I said, my dad used a typewriter for school, and he had to use whiteout for mistakes. Now young kids are using iPads at a young age. Personal computers were not around. There was no internet. No cell phones. If someone wanted to get a hold of another person, they would have to call them on a payphone. My dad listened to music on a record player. Music can now be downloaded instantly, and it's a huge difference how music is. Also, newspapers were delivered daily. Everyone got a newspaper. There were paper boys that delivered newspapers daily, and that's how they got their news for the most part. Yeah, nowadays most people don't even get newspapers. The newspaper is slowly dying out. Also, there was no 24-hour news program like there is now, or sports program. There was one news program each evening, and that was it. Now the world has pretty much become much smaller. People communicate instantly with other people around the world via Facebook, cell phones, Skype, all sorts of technologies that did not exist back then. Also, movies and music are much more graphic now than they were then. I mean, people say words now just on regular TV that you would never even dream of saying back in the 70s. So it's definitely become more graphic. Some similarities between then and now: we still use fax machines. My dad used this fax machine as a young kid in the 70s, and we still use them today, every day in business. And then people still want their news as fast as possible. That's something that's still similar. People need instant news as fast as possible. So this is the end of my video. Some of the things that I spoke about were some of the big historical, historical, social, and political events that were prevalent back in the 70s, including the Beatles, disco, the Vietnam War, the oil crisis of 73 and 78, the American hostage crisis, the resignation of Richard Nixon. I also talked about some of the biggest differences between growing up now versus then. Technology being the big key there. And so that summarizes Doug Klein for you. Thank you very much.